Thank you very much. Thank you very much to everybody, and thank you very much to Professor Chitty and the co-editors of this volume for the invitation to publish our research in the volume and also to present it today here with you. As you've already said, we will be presenting this research on the Scotland is Now campaign, and we will be talking briefly on Brexit, Scottish independence, and the value of values. Here we are. Setting the scene for our research is the Scottish national branding campaign, Scotland is Now, and its relation to Brexit and Scottish independence. What we're particularly focusing on is how progressive values are portrayed as a soft power resource for Scotland. This is a relative gap in the literature that we've identified, and we'd like to present this case study as it might not be very widely known. What we'll be doing in this short presentation today is we'll be discussing very briefly values and soft power and the nexus between values and soft power. And then I'll hand over to Alastair, who conducted the case study for Scotland is Now, and we will end with some conclusions. We're not going to dwell on what soft power is because everyone has done this already, and I'm sure that every single presenter has presented the literature and the salient debates and also key definitions of soft power through the ages. But just in terms of context and to contextualize our research, we are looking at the aspects of soft power such as attractiveness and influence. And we are also focusing on soft power resources, the resources that Nye introduced back in the 90s of cultural attraction, ideology, and international institutions. We are particularly looking at soft power and nation branding. And if we look at soft power and nation branding in general, we will see that a very popular way of researching or of discussing soft power and nation branding is Anholt's hexagon, which encompasses tourism, governance, exports, and other aspects that are mentioned on the slide, but also the aspect of competitive identity and competitive soft power. And that has been a new model for national competitiveness that also touches upon public diplomacy and brand management. So we're moving a little bit from soft power to brand management there. But going back to Nye's conceptions about soft power, he says that the soft power of a country rests on culture, political values, and foreign policies. With that in mind, we also wanted to add the aspect of civic virtue, and that's something that other scholars such as Naren Chitty have mentioned in the past. Civic virtue in the sense of citizenship in the broadest sense in terms of commitment rather than citizenship as your passport. So the personal values that someone brings to civic virtues and to citizenship, the civic engagements, and the effective functioning of civil and political orders. What we see, though, is that there is a clear element there of values, and within these civic virtues, values come into play. But we haven't seen that values have been adequately thematized in the literature. Or at least, or even if it is thematized, it's not elaborated as extensively as other aspects of soft power that have to do more with brand management. So we argue that soft power has a two-dimensional connection to values, which you will see from the diagram that we've provided. Soft power is of value to those who create it, so there is a value to it, but values can also serve as a source of soft power. In this, we follow Greber's sort of anthropological theory of value, and we suggest that both of these interpretations are actually variations of the same thing. So the way in which actions become meaningful to an actor is by being incorporated in some larger social reality or social totality, and that's what Greber says. And if we apply this to soft power, this means that resources of soft power become actions. And really the resources are nothing that is static, but they're actions that can change. And values can be interpreted in many ways. As we know that we have economic value, we have philosophical or moral values, and this comes back to the civic virtues that we were talking earlier. And there's so much more to that. And the value of values, which is what we saw in our chapter, is something that is not new. It's been thematized by scholars before, but it is under-researched. And the centrality of values and soft power is something that we'd like to focus on in this case study. Over to you, Alastair.
Thank you. Just in case that when I speak, it's possible that the presentation goes away from focus on your side. You can pin the presentation on Katerina's diagram or on Zoom, and then you'll still be able to see it while I speak. So I will be talking about our case study, the Scotland Is Now campaign. This is Scotland's current national branding campaign. It was launched in April 2018 by the Scottish Government and key partners such as Visit Scotland, the Scottish Tourism Agency. As most nation branding campaigns, it aims to convince people to visit Scotland, for example, for tourism, or to do business there, or even to move there for work, study, or other reasons. You will find outputs of the campaign in some strategic places across Scotland, for example, airports or tourist centres, but of course also outside Scotland, for example, on social media. Generally, the outputs are variations on a similar format. Each output will have a particular theme with a picture or video depicting it, and then the tagline "Scotland is now," sometimes preceded by a variation on it, such as "Scotland is open." Could I have the next slide, please? Now, branding campaigns depicting the nation are not a new thing in Scotland. It is beyond the scope of our chapter or this presentation to go into the history of them, but fair to say that Scotland has had a certain brand for over 150 years now, and this brand has actively been used to attract people and investment to the country. This brand is closely related to some well-known themes or stereotypes linked to Scotland, and I'm sure that even if you've never seen any of these posters or similar ones before, you will still have certain associations with Scotland, supported by years of myth-making in Scotland and further afield, significantly by Hollywood. I think most people in Scotland today would argue that these posters, in particular the one on the left here, are neither accurate nor an up-to-date representation of the country. Next slide, please. Seeing if that works. Here we go. The Scotland Is Now campaign follows this zeitgeist and portrays Scotland in a new way. Indeed, in this example here, the poster literally invites the viewer to see Scotland in a brand new light. The image features the three Forth bridges, which are just northwest of Edinburgh and connect the capital to the county of Fife on the other side of the Forth estuary. Now, on the left of the picture, you can just about still see the Forth rail bridge, that's the red one there, which was completed in 1889 and has featured on many travel posters of Scotland in the past. And for good reason. It is an impressive structure, a feat of Victorian engineering, but it hardly features in this image. Instead, the image focuses on the new, the most recently built bridge, the Queensferry Crossing, completed in 2017. Indeed, the whole Scotland Is Now campaign seems to rid itself of these classic ways of portraying the country, instead focusing on the new. On the website of the campaign, it is explained that the brand tells the authentic story of Scotland as a bold and positive country, rich in history and heritage, but moving forward in a way that is progressive, pioneering, and inclusive. Note the classic selling points of Scotland are still there, rich in history and heritage, authentic, etc. But there is a clear emphasis on moving forwards towards new soft power attributes, being progressive, pioneering, and inclusive. Clearly, values play a role here, as it even includes a value in that line, being inclusive. So here I would like to focus on this values aspect of the campaign, which I will do from two perspectives, the temporal and the spatial. First, the temporal, as time does seem to play an important role here, of course noted by the inclusion of now in the campaign title, which is actually a bit strange at first sight. What do they mean by Scotland is now? Surely we are all now, aren't we? There are two ways to approach this. The first we've already discussed. The campaign is a clear invitation to rethink certain ideas or stereotypes about Scotland, many of which are linked to Scotland's romanticised history. Instead, it presents contemporary Scotland, suggesting that the authentic Scotland is found in the present, not the past. But more than just making a break with the past, the campaign also points to the future. A hint of this is given in the official description of the campaign mentioned before, that Scotland is progressive. Now, progressive values is one of these terms which is used a lot, but without being discussed critically very often. What do we mean with progressive? Adjectives such as progressive or indeed regressive suggest that values are fluid, that in the case of progressive values, they may seem out of the ordinary today, but will become the norm in the future. That they are ahead of their time, in other words, and that they provide a glimpse of what is to come. For example, in this tweet here, which you can see on the right, it focuses on a scheme in Scotland to provide access to free sanitary products for students in schools, colleges and universities, which later resulted in the Free Provision of Period Products Scotland Act in 2021, which places duties on local authorities and education providers to make period products obtainable free of charge for anyone who needs to use them. Beside the obvious societal benefit of the Act itself, there is further benefit created here by means of values. Following Greba, here is an action which gains meaning through a system of values, a system which we'd probably refer to as progressive values. And by the use of these values in the campaign, this is then converted into soft power, proving these values are also of value. And this seems to have worked. Note what is written in the tweet, that Scotland is the first country in the world to do this, and that others have followed. On the one hand, this adds perspective to the now in Scotland is now, because Scotland becomes the first place in the world to experience the future today. But it is also a fine example of a small state increasing its influence by use of soft power. Indeed, even though Scotland's ability to act independently on the global stage is limited by its membership of the United Kingdom, it is able to instate laws like this, thereby clearly still exerting a certain international influence. Next slide, please. A similar approach is found in a video of the Scotland is Now campaign about Hot Scots FC, Scotland's first LGBT-friendly football club. Now, we don't have time to watch these videos during this presentation, but I will put a link to them in the chat and then you can watch them in your own time if you're interested. In this video, it is said that Scotland made it possible for Hot Scots to exist because people are open to change and progressive in Scotland. Here, although it is not a particular law which is being used as an example, there is a clear action: the creation and social acceptance of the football club in question. Again, actions which gain meaning through value, and those values being of value in a national branding campaign. Next slide, please. A further example which does not use a particular law as an action as its starting point is this video, which tells the story of Jured, a Syrian refugee who settled in Scotland. Jured tells of how he was welcomed into Scottish society and refers to himself as a New Scot, a term which is used to refer to people who settled in Scotland and is actively encouraged by the government. The title of the video includes Scotland is welcoming, and that theme of inclusivity is clear throughout it. But what is interesting here is that Scotland actually does not have control over its own immigration laws. This is what is called a devolved power and is regulated by the British government for the whole of the UK. In fact, the British immigration policy is not particularly welcoming at all, and the number of Syrian refugees in the UK is small compared to other similarly sized countries in Europe. Now, this immigration policy is not something the current Scottish government agrees with. It is pro-immigration and argues that Scotland actually needs immigration to counteract population decline. But there is not much it can do about it within the current constitutional arrangement. So this video not only appears to be a statement on Scotland's values, but also a statement on how they differ from the UK. Next slide, please. And this brings us to the second perspective of the campaign, which I would like to discuss, the spatial perspective. I don't believe we can discuss the Scotland is Now campaign without also discussing its British counterpart, the Great Britain campaign. Developed in 2011, this national branding campaign for the UK looks surprisingly similar to the Scottish campaign. Different posters, each with their own theme, But instead of saying Scotland is now, the post has mentioned a particular theme followed by it's great in Britain and Northern Ireland. The resemblance between the campaigns is striking. Now, I cannot confirm that the Scottish campaign was made as a direct reaction to the British campaign, but to me, they appear too similar to be a coincidence. And as someone involved with the Scottish campaign told me, Britain may be great, but Scotland is now. In other words, Scotland's progressive values are actively contrasted to the British campaign and the themes which it portrays, which are not really related to values at all, or even particularly unique in the examples on this slide. Thus, the Scottish campaign uses values to disassociate the country from the rest of the UK. Next slide, please. Where this becomes particularly apparent is the Scottish campaign's outputs concerning Europe. There are a number of videos and posters which mention Scotland's warm, open, and importantly, enduring relationship with Europe. These particular outputs were also made available in different European languages. Any reference to Scotland's relationship to Europe these days requires us to mention Brexit, the departure of the UK from the European Union. As you may be aware, in 2016, 52% of British voters chose to leave the EU. But in Scotland, 62%, a large majority, voted to remain in the EU. Because the Scottish population is only a small part of the total British population, this was not enough to sway the combined outcome to remain. Now, why has the Scotland is Now campaign incorporated Brexit into its narrative, and how does it fit with its overall theme of progressive values? Visibly rejecting Brexit may have some benefits for a Scottish soft power strategy. Indeed, it has been argued that Brexit was damaging to British soft power. The narratives supportive of leaving the European Union were often built upon themes of British exceptionalism and a nostalgia for a heroic colonial past. Although the Great Britain campaign was started long before Brexit, its message of being great does little to argue against these themes. Brexit may therefore influence how the Great Britain campaign is perceived abroad, in particular in Europe, and depending on political persuasion, might even be detrimental to the United Kingdom's soft power. By disassociating Scotland from this nostalgia and clearly contrasting it, the focus on progressive values of the Scottish campaign thus serves as a form of soft power damage limitation, while also further emphasizing its futurist element. But if the use of progressive values as soft power resources is built upon actions which gain meaning in the context of these values, how can a poster which represents no more than a sentiment be effective? The posters shown here both display people standing at the waterside, but little else. But when Scottish voters rejected Brexit in 2016, that in itself was an action which may represent values, for example, an openness to immigration from the European Union. The campaign then uses Scotland's vote in the EU referendum to underpin and validate its message. Thus, these European outputs of the campaign suggest that the actions do not need to be limited to those done by a government, for example, a law on period equality, but could also be done or be perceived to be done by a people. The Scotland is Now campaign thus uses progressive values to its benefit in the competitive context of post-Brexit Britain in several ways. First, it disassociates Scotland from the soft disempowerment of Brexit, acting as a form of damage limitation. Second, it uses this differentiation to highlight its own values, in particular its progressiveness. Finally, it could also be understood as an act of preemptive soft diplomacy. Brexit has provided a new context to the debate on Scottish independence. Political analysts have argued that if Scotland would ever want to rejoin the European Union as an independent member state, it would need to be able to indicate that it would have a different attitude to the bloc than the United Kingdom used to have. By highlighting its progressiveness and openness towards Europe instead of a perceived grandeur associated with the nationalism of Brexit, it visibly aligns Scottish nationalism with core values of the European Union. So, to conclude, values can be used as soft power resources, but do need a strong emphasis on actions to be portrayed effectively. And using progressive values as soft power resources can help shape the imagination of the future, attract people to experience the future in the present, and portray the uniqueness of a state. The Scotland is Now campaign does this effectively by portraying actions which gain meaning through a system of progressive values, thereby giving values value or soft power. Spatially, the Scotland is Now campaign appears to use values to actively contrast Scotland from the rest of the UK and align itself with Europe. And in doing so, it uses values as a form of soft power damage limitation in the context of Brexit. But it could also be interpreted as a form of preemptive soft diplomacy without mentioning independence at all. So thank you very much for listening to our presentation, and also thank you very much to the editors of this volume. And yeah, of course, we're open to any questions you may have.